Britain is unprepared for war at any scale and cannot defend its own homeland. That is the stark warning of a defence insider.
Just inside a tank on our way into Gaza. There is just rubble and destruction as far as you can see.
They're digging in their positions, they're practising. Point accuracy over targets is what has transformed so much of this conflict.
This is World at War. I'm the Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey, and joining me today is General the Lord Richard Dannatt, former Chief of the General Staff. General Dannatt, thank you for joining me. That stark assessment of the UK's defence, unable to defend the homeland, is it correct?
Well, it's quite remarkable that Dr. Rob Johnson, who had for 2 years been heading the Ministry of Defence's Net Assessment and Challenges Organisation Directorate, something that was set up to be an independent inspector, if you like, of the Ministry of Defence capability, has come out with such a searingly critical analysis of the UK's defence capability. And if you read it in detail, the coverage in today's newspapers, he really criticises everything across the piece, from the capabilities of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, our ammunition holdings. And frankly, it's a condemnation or culmination, probably, of serial underfunding since the end of the Cold War and serial taking of peace dividends, which frankly have been taken by successive chancellors too greedily, and it's left us in a very poor position. So Rob Johnson has put this very critical report out in a timely fashion, but it's very embarrassing, not just for the current government, but I think for the previous government as well.
You've been in the heart of defence. You've led the British Army from 2006 to 2009. And since then, we've seen about 25% of the soldiers disappear. You commanded 102,000. We're down to, well, now a little bit over 72,000 trained troops. Do you recognise Dr. Johnson's characterisation of not just our army, but our armed forces? Are the armed forces ready for conflict?
Well, the thing is that the United Kingdom, perfectly reasonably, has aspired to be what's called a Tier 1 military power, that we aspire to have an Army, Navy, Air Force, a Marine landing force of a certain quality and capability. But the fact of the matter is, at just over 2% of GDP being spent on defence, there isn't enough quantum of money going into the Ministry of Defence to produce the capabilities that we all aspire to. And successive underfunding of defence has resulted in cuts, a drive for efficiency, which is another word for cuts, and it's produced a capability that just isn't credible at the present time. And of course, we quite rightly are supporting Ukraine, but in supporting Ukraine, we've given them a large amount of military equipment. We've given them a huge amount of the stockpiled ammunition and missiles that we have got. But we're not replenishing at the speed that we should or that we could. Industry isn't really supporting the Ministry of Defence in the way that it might. So whichever way you look at it, Dr. Johnson's criticisms are damaging, they're embarrassing, but sadly, they're transparently true.
And what does not credible mean in real terms?
Well, let's take the Army's aspiration. What we aspire and commit to NATO to be able to deliver is a war-fighting division. That's a force of, let's say, between 25 and 35,000, the same sort of force that we deployed in the First and the Second Gulf War, comprising 3 manoeuvre brigades, tank, armoured infantry, heavy manoeuvre brigades, the sort of thing that the Americans would expect us to put into an alliance or coalition operation. Frankly, we can't do that. We would be struggling today to put one of those 3 brigades into the field, not all 3 in a joined-up manoeuvre warfighting division. That's just an example of what we say that we should be able to do and what we cannot do. And much the same applies to the Navy and the Air Force. There's some fantastic fast jets, the F-35s. We just haven't got enough of them. The astute submarines, extraordinarily high-tech pieces of equipment, but we haven't got enough of them. And the same goes for frigates and destroyers. There are shipbuilding plans, but they're not being pushed through fast enough, and they're not being put through at a quantity that's sufficient. So whichever way you look at it, we are less capable than we say that we ought to be. And it comes down to resourcing. Yes, and also there is an element of our procurement isn't as efficient and probably rather more wasteful than it ought to be. But that's only part of the story and shouldn't be used by the Treasury as an excuse to bat off the Ministry of Defence's desire for a greater level of resource, of money.
General Dannatt, do you think, I mean, these are fairly stark warnings, alarming warnings. Do you think any of this would come as a surprise to the Kremlin? They'll be looking at all of the militaries across NATO to see that the British armed forces, in your own words, in Dr. Johnson's words, appear to be something in some ways of a paper tiger, unable to meet their ambitions. Will that surprise Vladimir Putin?
It won't surprise him because actually commentators have been saying this for quite some time. The disappointing thing is that the current government, and I would say the previous government, haven't listened to the warnings that have been offered. I think the significant thing about Dr. Rob Johnson's report is that he is a defence expert brought in by the Ministry of Defence to analyse things, and he is saying these things as a result of his own analysis. Now, you could say retired generals like me, admirals like Lord West or air marshals would say these things, wouldn't we? Well, we would say them because actually we passionately believe that this country should have a credible and strong defence. But when you get an independent expert analysing what the Ministry of Defence is doing, and he comes out with these stark warnings, frankly, it's very difficult for the current government, and let's face it, we may well have a new government come Friday. Any future government of this country has got to sit up and take note, because this is where we start to get into the realms of drawing comparisons between the world as we see it today and Europe as we see it today, with as it was in the mid-late 1930s. We had the rise of a dictator in the mid-1930s. We chose not to rearm, we chose to appease him. When the policy of appeasement failed, too late we began a period of rearmament. The British Army was defeated in France in May-June 1940. We were just not defeated as a nation because we had built just enough Spitfires and Hurricanes for a sufficient number of brave young men to fly them successfully in the Battle of Britain. But at that moment, Britain stood alone. And thank goodness we had a leader like Winston Churchill who could inspire the nation and ensure that there was a glimmer of hope for Europe, which of course eventually, after 3 or 4 years with allies, became D-Day, Operation Overlord, the Normandy campaign that began the path to restoring peace and freedom to Europe. Those are the sort of analogies that we're looking at. And what we have to say is, are we or are we not learning the lessons of history? Are we refusing to increase our defence expenditure? Are we refusing to rearm and up our capability? And therefore, are we doomed not to learn the lessons of history and the cautionary tale that the 1930s should tell us?
And Richard, in your opinion, I mean, you've written a book, Victory, Defeat to Defeat. Are we learning those lessons? Have we learnt those lessons? So
far, we're not. I mean, Victory to Defeat, the British Army 1918 to 1940, is a book that asks the question, how come with Allies in 1918 we beat the Germans, and less than 22 years later, the German army defeated us in France in May-June 1940. Frankly, government policy was such that resourcing was so small that our army was incapable of doing what it should have been doing. And that pretty much went for all three armed forces. And that's what we have to avoid today.
General Dannatt, thank you very much for joining us. I'm The Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey. If you're watching this on YouTube and you have any questions for me or General Dannatt, please ask them in the comments below and we will try to answer some of them next week.